I'd let you know.
Oh,
There you go.
okay. All right. Hey guys, I'm Austin Boyd with Heavy on Raiders, and today we're talking to former NFL GM and executive Randy Mueller. We're going to talk some Raiders football. Randy was the general manager for the Seattle Seahawks back in the day. He also spent over a decade with the Los Angeles/San Diego Chargers, so he's quite familiar with the AFC West, I would imagine. So, Randy, the first thing I guess I want to talk to you about is Derek Carr's extension. So I'm sure you saw the figures, how it's built out and everything. So what do you make of the extension, and how is it a team friendly deal?
Well, I think an extension like this seems to be rarer and rarer as we get through these new age cap contracts. Obviously, I think it's good for both sides. I think the Raiders secure their best player. Now they can plan around cap numbers out for the next several years. That's rare, but it's really good for them. I think they figured out that Derek Carr was their best option, right? They're not going to be able to acquire a player at that position that moves the needle ahead from where Derek Carr is. So the good news for them is that Derek wanted to be a Raider. I think he made that clear. He's also proved he's above and beyond being the face of a franchise in the chaos that they had last year, whether it's the tragedy of Ruggs, the chaos of John Gruden. I mean, Derek Carr stood tall and did a great job for that franchise. I think there's some reward coming his way for that, and that was part of this. But you're right; it's a different world in that I think it's good for both sides. So the team friendly part of it, low amount of guarantee helps the team, like I said, with flexibility, puts him in a group still that he can hang his hat on. That he's one of the highest paid quarterbacks, but it's fair on average. Um, it's a deal that I think can serve the longevity of the deal. Austin, a lot of these deals get done in the last couple of years. Nobody ever sees them because they disappear for some reason. I think this is actually one that could find its way through its eternity, so to speak. They did a nice job of this because the cap years, the last 2 years, the cap is only at about 40 million only, but that's still pretty good. And even the last year, the cap goes down $700,000. So when you get into the weeds of the contract itself, it definitely makes sense. And I think the guarantees will come as they get into this deal. They can surely tear up base contracts and add guarantees later. So I think there's some trust factor on both sides.
Yeah, just to follow up on the Derek Carr contract, I think it was Mike Florio of Pro Football Talk, who pointed out that there's like a 3-day window after the Super Bowl next season
Yeah.
where the Raiders could just straight up cut Derek Carr
Mm-hmm.
without any repercussions. Do you think there's any chance that that would actually happen?
Well, I don't know why they would, because the cap numbers are very acceptable in the deal. I think the key is there is some trust on both sides. I don't know that a better option is going to ever be available for them right now. Now, everything changes. We all know that, hey, we're all week to week, right? Everything's fluid. But I just see a commitment here that I think it's an extension of Derek Carr and his agent's hand to say, hey, we'll do what we can, take care of us on the other end. And that doesn't happen very often. I'm not saying it's a wink, wink deal, but I think it's good for everybody. So I think it is a year-to-year deal, but I don't see any reason why it would be, I guess is what I'm saying.
Awesome, cool. So I also wanted to ask you, I know after the Devontae Adams trade, there were some people saying, like, I think John Kuhn, former Packer, kind of came out, so the Raiders got fleeced. So I was just going to ask, like, is that a deal you would have made, the first and second round pick for Devontae Adams plus the big contract that they gave him?
I think it's complicated. I'll answer that clearly first. It would have been hard for me to pull the trigger, but let me just say this. Coming from New England, where Josh McDaniel and Dave Ziegler came from, they really had a hard time evaluating and developing receivers. They've really spun out on more opportunities to draft, to sign, and it's never come to fruition. So they feel like they had a chance to get a proven commodity so they could take doubt out of it, right? And I'm not blaming them for the inadequacies of the Patriots receiver dilemma over really the last 10 years. I'm just saying they lived it. So they're probably saying, hey, forget all that stuff. Let's just go get the best one we can. So I understand why they did it. I still think, in my opinion, I would have struggled to do it. I think as a confident evaluator of players, I can find wide receivers. That's what I think. I think I can find them outside the first round, which you see now with the other names that are out there looking to get paid, whether it's Debo Samuel or Tyreek Hill or DK Metcalf, AJ Brown. None of these guys were first round picks. So somebody identified them in rounds 2 or later. And I think that's, again, from me as a GM who is confident I can find these kind of guys, I think that's where I probably would have erred. I think the biggest problem with the Davante Adams deal for the Raiders is not his ability. He's a really good player, but it's in the latter years of the contract, like we just talked about with Derek, a leveling off. Well, Davante's doesn't. To pay a non-quarterback $40 million in cap dollars in a cap that's maybe gets to 250 or 260, that's hard for me to swallow. So I don't know that I could have done that. I probably would have taken my chances. Hey, we're just starting kind of a retooling. We're a new regime. I'm not sure I would have paid, $30 million for a receiver and give up all the other compensative parts to it. That's the other part is you're giving up draft picks. You're giving up chances to build your team out in other ways. So it would have been a hard one for me.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think for the Raiders specifically, they might be the only team where it really made a lot of sense because you have to his relationship with Derek Carr and the rapport that they already have. That's something that isn't that doesn't happen often to where you can find a veteran wide receiver who's considered one of the best in the NFL, who also happened to go to college with the Raiders starting quarterback.
Right.
So I think for the Raiders it makes a lot of sense because also Carr kind of mentioned that a big reason he was willing to take that team friendly deal was because they proved to him when they traded for Davante Adams that they're all about winning. Like they're willing to do what they can to help him. So I think for the Raiders it makes a lot of sense. If it would have been, say, the Dolphins or some other team that traded for Davante Adams with that exact same deal, it wouldn't have been worthwhile. But I think for the Raiders, because either they were probably going to use a first or second round pick on a wide receiver anyway, so might as well just get the more proven commodity who already has that rapport with your quarterback.
Yeah, I understand that part of it. It's a good point. I think relationships do matter. I think that the first year contract or the first contract of a rookie gives you more flexibility. But like I said, they weighed that against, hey, we couldn't find one or develop one in New England in 10 or 12 years. So let's put it all to bed. Let's get our quarterback, one of his best buddies, a college teammate. So I understand how it makes sense. And maybe that's what brought it to kind of a perfect storm for the Raiders. And I'm not saying they're not good because of it. They will be. I think at some point it's going to eat away a little bit at their flexibility cap-wise, because really that's all it's about. It's about cap allocation, and that's why Baskin Robbins has 31 flavors, right? We all get to pick our favorite ice cream, and this is the way they're picking it.
Oh, yeah. No, that's interesting. Well, that kind of segues into my next question. So the Raiders paid Max Crosby. They paid Chandler Jones. They paid Derek Carr. They paid Davante Adams. They still have several notable players that are going to need contracts soon. So you look at Darren Waller, he still has 2 years left on his deal, but he's only making about $7.5 million a year, which is, I did something on this the other day. I think he's about the 15th highest paid tight end, when a lot of people look at him as a top 3, top 4 tight end. You also have Hunter Renfrow entering the last year of his deal. And I mean, he made a Pro Bowl last year. He really proved a lot to be that he's one of the better slot receivers in the NFL. And then you also have Josh Jacobs, who he's kind of coming off a down year, but I mean, as a rookie, he was dynamic, and under Josh McDaniels, he could be in for a huge year, which obviously would lead to him wanting a bigger contract. So if given the choice between Waller, Renfrow, and Jacobs, if you could only choose one, which one would you extend?
Well, I think the good news is they all are good players. I don't know that they can choose a bad one, but if we're going to use the analogies from prior time in New England for Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels, you have to look no further than the importance that New England's put on tight ends there the last 15 years, right? They found ways to utilize tight ends, I think, better than any team in the league. And that a lot is on the plate of Josh McDaniels. So I wouldn't doubt it that Waller is the guy they make their next highest paid guy. And I totally would agree with that. So given those options, I would pick Darren Waller. I'm agreeing with you. I think he's a top 3 or 4 talent. I would like to secure that long term. But I think it's just as much about the positions these guys play and allocating the assets accordingly. I go back to this, and maybe it's arrogance as an evaluator, but I think they found in New England that they could interchange slot receivers, whether it was Wes Welker or Amendola or whoever. They found a way to make that a moving target, and that's not to devalue Hunter Renfrow. I'm just saying I think they would think they could find those guys, and let's face it, Renfrow is a third down specialist and a slot guy. I can't imagine them paying him crazy money. So again, Waller checked that box, and the same for Josh Jacobs. I think that's a position that we all know has kind of been devalued. He can be great, but he's still in a system that kind of dictates the production per se. So I think it would make sense for these guys, and again, for the Raiders, to pay Darren Waller and solidify a long-term deal with him. So again, no offense to the other 2 guys, just might make most sense for all those reasons to take care of Waller's deal.
Yeah, and obviously, I think the Renfrow, like Waller, he just hired Clutch Sports, so like I feel like there's probably more there's more pressure there to probably get a deal done than with Renfrow. I feel like if you put Renfrow on the franchise tag, he's not gonna throw a fit about it or anything. So I think you have more flexibility with him down the road too than you would with Waller, who Clutch might kind of, I mean, obviously they're more known in the NBA, but they might stir the pot a little bit if the Raiders aren't giving him what he wants. So, and like you said, an elite tight end is probably a little harder to come by than an elite slot receiver, especially in the Patriots system. So I'm sure a lot of Raiders fans will balk at the idea of picking anybody over Renfrow because he's been so important for them. But in the grand scheme of things, Waller is probably the more valuable asset.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think fans would probably be a little surprised that inside NFL buildings, the players' representation doesn't really warrant any moves. I don't think they would do anything because of the agency that they hired. Let's face it, the team has some leverage in all these deals. The other thing about Hunter Renfrow is, and you mentioned the franchise tag, that pays people at the average of the top 5 at their position. Are we saying that Hunter Renfrow's in the top 5 receivers in the NFL? I don't think so. But I don't think he would demand that kind of money either. So not to change any of the narratives that we've talked through, but it's funny to me that the perception on the outside of how people make decisions from within, having sat in that chair for years, it's totally different. So I think the Raiders will do the right thing, and I think in this case it is to sign Waller, but I don't think they'll be pressured by any outside sources, whether it's media or fans' wishes or anything like that, to do anything that they don't want to do. That's just not the way NFL teams operate.
Yeah, and also, I mean, just because they sign Waller doesn't mean they can't also keep Renfrow. Like, if Renfrow's willing to take 4 years, $40 million, like that's probably workable with a Waller deal too. Yeah. So it all depends what he's looking for. Like if he's looking for Debo money, he's probably not going to get it. You can't pay 2 wide receivers a combined 50 million a year.
Well, let's see what Debo gets before we. Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting. So one thing I really wanted to ask you about was, so you were in the AFC West with the Chargers during Josh McDaniels, during his brief stint as the Broncos head coach. So what I wanted to ask you is, what did you make of him then as a head coach, and what do you make of him now, all these years later, and how he's possibly changed?
Well, I'll try to sugarcoat it as much as I can, but I would say this: his days in Denver were, I think, an unmitigated disaster. I mean, that was not a good situation. Having observed it from the outside, I think there's a lot of things Josh would have done different. I do think he's a really good coach, and I was one of the first to say this year, when the season started this past year, that he would get a head job. But I don't know whether it was arrogance in evaluating talent or dealing with people, but even he himself has admitted some of that was maybe some immaturity. It was just not a way to run an organization. I felt like he thought he was the smartest guy in the room, and he made sure every day that everybody knew that. And I think he's grown from that. I mean, that's been many moons ago. We all are better the second time around at, I think, whatever job we have. So hopefully the maturity is set in. I just think he struggled to be a leader in the right way back then. I do think this could be different in that I already have heard some of the things he's said. And so he has taken accountability for a lot of the things in the past, but also having Dave Ziegler, who by all accounts, a very close friend of his, in the chair next to him, I think that will help Josh a lot this time around. I think Raider fans should feel comfort in that Ziegler comes from the same source in New England, but I think most would say he's an independent thinker and would do things on his own, not just because of the way we did it in New England. So I think that's good for Josh as well. I just think he'll be much better prepared this time around to do that. So we'll see. Time will tell. I think it's a tough division, as I'm sure people have, realized, and every team making moves, so it makes it hard. But, we'll see if he learned from the past. That's for sure. I think talking about it is one thing, but obviously actions will speak louder as we get closer to the season and during the season.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting about the Raiders' approach, and Mark Davis talked about this, he really wanted, because obviously they moved on from Rich Bisaccia and they fired Mike Mayock. So a big part of the Raiders' approach was they wanted a general manager and head coach combo. Like that essentially came as a package deal. So he said anytime he interviewed a general manager, he wanted them to give him a head coaching candidate that they would want. And then flipped over too with the head coaching candidates to give them a GM they want. What do you think about that approach, and do you think it's a smart one?
Well, I think it's always a smart one. I think it's sometimes viewed by others as it's a novel approach. It's always what you want. I think it's overstating the obvious, to be honest with you. Nobody's going to enter a marriage where they don't enjoy dating. That's just not the way it works, And so most NFL teams, I'll say all NFL teams, strive for that. The relationship between the head coach and the GM is probably the most important in the whole building. They have to be on the same page. They have to respect each other. They have to work on communicating every day and have a trust and bond that is higher than any other relationship in the building, even than the coach and quarterback relationship. So I think it makes sense without a doubt. I think they had in the back of their mind a setup like this already in mind, probably when Mark stated the criteria of what we're looking for. But again, that kind of goes without saying. I think any franchise would look for that. So I don't think this is a unique setup at all.
Okay, interesting. So a major talking point around the NFL this season has been the AFC West and basically like the arms race in the AFC West. So you look at the Chargers adding Khalil Mack and JC Jackson. You look at the Broncos adding Russell Wilson, and the Raiders adding Chandler Jones, Devontae Adams. And then for the Chiefs, they've mostly they traded away Tyreek Hill, and they brought in some smaller pieces, but they're losing Honey Badger, they're losing Tyreek Hill. So what I want to ask you is, who do you think, or which team do you think has the best chance to unseat the Chiefs as the AFC West champs this year?
Well, I think that's easier said than done as well. I still think, and you're, I think, agreeing that Kansas City's the best team. They're the team to beat. They still, to me, have the best coach. They have the best quarterback. People say, well, they don't have Tyreek Hill. I got news for you. Tyreek Hill missed 4 games in 2019, and I think Pat Mahomes threw for over 380 yards per game. So I trust that they're still going to be good. I know the Chargers always seem to get the offseason flavor of the month award. They always make a splash signing or two. They definitely have improved their chances on paper. I'll be honest, I don't really trust the coach yet. Some of the controversial moves he made last year, I don't know if that is going to be the same MO we use this year, but I think he cost his team a win or two. And again, we talked about being the smartest guy in the room. I think he wants to be known as that, and that comes across, which is too bad. I think if we're going to reinvent football and reinvent the wheel, I'm not sure that that's the way to go about catching everybody else. But they're definitely better as a group. So let's see if they can kind of fight through some adversity as well. And you mentioned Denver acquiring Russell Wilson. my question is, and I live in Seattle, so I've seen Russell Wilson the last couple of years. My follow-up question is, what Russell Wilson have they acquired? Because in the last year and a half, Russell hasn't been Russell. It's not let Russell cook. That he hasn't played to the old Russell standards that he set himself. So I don't think his legs have come through for him like they did early in his career. He was always able to extend plays and late in downs make things happen. That hasn't happened in Seattle the last couple of years. So we see now all the optimism out of Denver, and I understand it. He's doing everything he can to kind of increase juice, increase electricity, increase expectations. And he's good at that, being a leader, saying the right things. He's always going to do that. But I'm going to wait and see where Denver is as a whole and where Russell's game is before I start to drink the Denver Super Bowl Kool-Aid, I guess. So I don't know who's going to unseat Kansas City, to answer your question. I don't think any of them are. Is that a possible? Is that one of the
Yeah, no, that's an
A through D
fair
answer?
answer.
I don't think anybody can. So I
It
just
won't
don't
be
think they're
popular
gonna-
on this page, but
Yeah, I understand. And I understand. And their fans should have expectations. I get it. I just think there's a lot of moving parts still with the Raiders. That's probably why and again, this is just my opinion. That's probably why I struggled more with the Devontae deal, because I think there's some still questions about their offensive line. There's questions about schemes on defense. I'll say this about the Raiders, and this is maybe the most undervalued and under talked about thing, in my opinion, with regard to the new regime at the Raiders. Patrick Graham is good. And he did a really good job in New York with their defense the last couple of years by fitting in the exact pieces that he will use from a strengths and weaknesses standpoint. He comes from New England too. And the fact that he's able to add players to do exactly what he wants to do on defense is something he learned from Bill Belichick. So I think that's undervalued there. If he can get enough out of what they have on defense on paper, I think the Raiders could be the team to take the next step. People forget the Raiders made the playoffs last year. So if I was going to pick a team and you were really holding me to it, it might be because of Patrick Graham that I picked the Raiders, not because of everything else we've talked about.
wow, yeah, that's really interesting because it is a massive philosophical change defensively, going from Gus Bradley, who is cover three. I mean, obviously you're in Seattle, so you know that defense probably like the back of your hand. Like, it's cover three, purist. We're not blitzing. We're not changing up coverages or anything. We're not doing the two high safeties against the Chiefs. They're going to get cute and then get blown out by 40 points. So it is interesting that they're having that huge philosophical change, and hopefully it works out. I mean, I know Patrick Graham's defenses in Miami and New York didn't always have like the greatest numbers, but you also have to keep in mind like the personnel he was working with. It's like now he comes to the Raiders, he gets Chandler Jones, he gets Max Crosby, and there are still some pieces. It'd be nice if they can add another safety, maybe get a bit of an interior pass rush, but also like maybe Patrick Graham is able to unlock some of these skills and some of these young players that the Raiders have added.
I think where his strength is, Austin, is that he can identify within a player a specific skill set that he will use. And that's what Bill Belichick has done over the years better than any coach in the history of the game. So I do think Patrick has that ability. And I think just because you didn't see the Giants improve on paper statistically, they definitely improved in fit, in building the exact kind of scheme set to fit their players and vice versa. So I do think that may take a little time, especially coming from the Gus Bradley thing, like you mentioned. But I have a lot of faith in Patrick that they won't add players and then figure out what to do with them later, which is what I think the Raiders did a lot the last couple of years. They just signed players and really had no plan for them. There will be a plan in place for anything they add on defense, and I think Raider fans should be happy about that.
Yeah, and as you know, of course, like numbers don't tell the whole story. Like I think anybody, like obviously I've been watching the Raiders for years, and last year's defense looked so much better than any defense I've seen in a long time. And I mean, they still finished like 25th in scoring.
Right.
And the defense was a big reason that they went on that run towards the end, because the offense wasn't putting up huge numbers. So just because maybe the first few weeks, like we allow a lot of yards or points, or the Raiders allow a lot of yards or points, like it doesn't necessarily mean that Graham isn't doing a respectable job. So
It's going to be a
that'll
fun
definitely
process
be
to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, the only worry about hiring him is that he could get a head coaching job in the near future, and then they have to find a replacement. But that's a good problem to have. I was actually thinking about it, I was like, man, I can't remember the last time the Raiders had a coordinator that was a hot head coaching candidate. Like I literally can't remember that ever being the case.
That's a
So
good thing. Trust me, that's a real good thing.
yeah, no, that's a good thing that you
Good
definitely
problem to
want to
have.
have.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you, do you think the Raiders are still a few pieces away from being true Super Bowl contenders? You think they need it, like they need a season under Graham and McDaniels, see how all the pieces fit, and then possibly the following season, that's when they can really get into that mindset of Super Bowl or bust.
Yeah, I would concur with those thoughts. I still think they have some pieces to put in play. It's another reason I really struggled with the Devontae all-in 30 million. Just because I think they got some other pieces to fill. I like where they're headed. I think the moving parts on the roster and new schemes don't necessarily reek Super Bowl this year. But I'll say this: having taken over a franchise before, who was in a total rebuild, and I did this when I went from Seattle to New Orleans. We made massive changes to the roster on paper. Our coaches did a great job of bringing people together. And that's when I think you're going to see if Josh has learned anything from the past. He's got to find a way to motivate and bring them together quicker than the next team. And on paper is one thing. Managing your team throughout a long NFL season is totally different. And we'll see if the maturity and some of the things that haunted Josh in his last stop will help him this year. So if he has the magic dust and can bring people together, I don't see why the Raiders couldn't be another playoff team like they were last year. I just think they're probably a year or so away from making a deep run once they get to the playoffs.
One thing that's been like interesting for me to think about has been, everybody's like, Josh McDaniels, amazing play caller, great offensive mind, all that stuff. But that's a lot of the same things they said about John Gruden. So, like, I know a lot of people are expecting bigger things from Derek Carr, bigger things from Josh Jacobs, and bigger things from Hunter Renfrow. But at the same time, like, everybody considered Gruden an offensive guru. So what I'm wondering is, was Gruden's ability as an offensive coach overstated, and Josh McDaniels is an upgrade in that regard? Or is it basically they're kind of switching off, and like it's not a huge upgrade, it's just the fact that Gruden is no longer making personnel decisions? That's where the big upgrade comes.
I would probably concur with the second. I think the whole deal really oscillates on what Dave Ziegler brings to the table. I think that's the key. I think you could make a case, and we all know what John is and where he comes from, but probably John Gruden, the GM, got John Gruden, the coach, in trouble just because he couldn't get the right people in place. I know Mike was there, Mayock as the GM title, but I mean, Mike had never spent a day in an NFL office when John gave him that job. So that's a learning curve that I got news for you. It's hard to learn these jobs on the job training isn't really an NFL thing. So that was a struggle for me. So I think you're right. I think the biggest difference is the Dave Ziegler GM seat and what he brings to the table. One, in identifying talent, two, acquiring it, and then working hand in hand with Josh. I don't think one person can run an organization, and that was clear what was happening under John Gruden. He was running the whole thing. And I just don't think that's a viable direction for NFL franchises nowadays. So I think they're in better hands long term, mainly because of the changes they've made in the front office.
Cool. So I've got one more for you. And I think it's kind of a fun one because we kind of brought up Deebo Samuel earlier. And I know it's not going to happen, but you're John Lynch. I'm Dave Ziegler. I call you up. I offer you Hunter Renfrow, Josh Jacobs, and this year's third-round pick for Deebo. Do you take that deal?
I hang up. Sorry.
You hang up. Oh,
Renfrow doesn't do much for me. We already said the running back is a devalued position, and a third-round pick doesn't give me anything. So I don't even think there's a comeback on that deal. With all due respect, Austin, I couldn't make that deal. And for my money, that's why I don't think Deebo's going anywhere. I don't think anybody values Deebo Samuels more than the 49ers do. In Kyle Shanahan's scheme, he's a big deal. I don't know that Debo goes anywhere else and is half the deal that he is in San Francisco. So I would not take that deal. I think it'll be hard for someone to put together a deal from the outside looking in. Again, I think players are perceived differently inside NFL offices than they are by the fans and media on the outside. Just keep that in mind. And I can't imagine someone paying money for a deal. I shouldn't say paying money. I don't think a 49er team would be better even for considering a deal like that. I don't think Hunter makes them necessarily better. I don't think Jacobs makes them better. They have a couple running backs that they've already spent money on. So just not enough meat on that bone for me to consider.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, and the Raiders also don't need to be spending $25 million on another wide receiver.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you so much. This has been really insightful and interesting, and hopefully we can do it again in the near future, possibly before the season starts up.
Love it, Austin. Anytime. Let's get together and do it again.
Awesome. Sounds great. All right.